Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Scott. I'm with the San Diego Public Library Foundation. I manage the Library Shop, which is a nonprofit book and gift shop inside the Central Library. So the reason I'm here today is, first of all, to tell you about what the foundation does, which is we advocate and support for the San Diego Public Library. But we also have a bookstore. And so we sell books, including Caitlin Rother's latest book, which came out today. Right there, Death on Ocean Boulevard. JW has it held up for you. It's in paperback. It's $16.95. It just came out today. The Library Shop has it for sale if you visit libraryshopsd.org. The good thing about supporting the Library Shop is all the proceeds go to the San Diego Public Library to support programming like this. So it goes to a very worthy cause. We do free local delivery right now because of the pandemic, and we'll also ship it to anywhere you want for $4.95 flat rate. So I will put a link in the chat. My goal is that we get Caitlin's book on the New York Times bestseller list. So if everybody here in this meeting were to purchase a copy, we could get pretty close. So libraryshopsd.org, support the book, support the authors, support programming at the library. And speaking of programming at the library, I will real quick mention that there's been a budget release. I don't know if anyone has seen that lately, but this year's budget has some big cuts in store for the library system. And there is still time to let our voices be heard and let folks know that that is not how we want to make our decisions. We want to support the library's budget in full. So 10% cut is pretty heavy. It could affect programming like this, all sorts of services. So if you go to supportmylibrary.org, which is the foundation's website, there are links there, which I'll put in the chat, of easy ways to contact your city council representative. There are some public hearings coming up that if a lot of us show up and voice our support for the library could make a difference. So I will put all that in the chat. And meanwhile, I will get out of the way and I'll be ready to sell a book whenever you need one. But tonight's, I guess, mistress of ceremonies, right, Linda? Is that the proper?
Sure.
Yeah.
We can go with that.
Linda
That works.
Brawley, she's a great librarian. I've done a lot of author events with her, and it's always a joy. So thanks for having us. And Linda, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. So we'll be posting that link tonight as well to make sure that the link to buy the book is on the chat throughout the night. You can always go to the event calendar where you registered if you want to link to it directly. Okay, well, hello. As Scott said, my name is Linda Brawley. I'm a librarian in San Diego Humanities section at the San Diego Central Library. Welcome to tonight's special event. We are thrilled to be hosting the official launch of Caitlin Rother's brand new book, Death on Ocean Boulevard. In fact, I had asked Scott if he had a book I could use tonight to hold up, and he said no, they're all being sold really fast. So this is the place. If you want to get one, this is the time to do it. Before I introduce our guests, I would just like to ask everyone to keep their mics on mute until after the presentation. But please add your questions and positive comments into the chat area. After the discussion, about 7:55 or so, we're going to open it up to the audience and address any questions you might have. We'll do our best to get them all, but we have to keep it to a certain limit. And if we have any hiccups at all on Zoom, then we have an IT wizard, Kent Tran, here in the back to keep us all on board here. Okay, it is my great pleasure to introduce the stars of the program, the star. She's a local author and a frequent flyer on the New York Times bestseller list, Caitlin Rother. Caitlin has written or co-authored 14 books. As a TV crime commentator, she has done more than 200 media appearances, including 2020 People Magazine Investigates, Crime Watch Daily, Australia's World News, and shows on Netflix, Investigation Discovery, PBS, and I can go on and on and on. But you can find out all of this and more if you want to go to her website, which is caitlinrother.com. Leading the discussion is award-winning broadcast and digital journalist J.W. August. He always keeps his mantra in the forefront: afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. please help me welcome Caitlin and JW.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you all.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for everybody being here tonight. I think you're going to really enjoy this. This is a pretty good book. You know, this July will be the 10th anniversary of Rebecca Zahau's death. The circumstances surrounding the Spreckles Mansion hanging remain a subject of great interest and intrigue. It's a puzzle that remains a puzzle for many. I chased this story myself for many years, interviewing some of the people you will soon be hearing about. I even attempted to produce a documentary, broadcast documentary, but dropped the effort. I never was comfortable that I had all the answers, or at least most of them. But that's not the case with our author, Caitlin Rother, and her investigation into what happened at the Coronado Mansion. She found a great deal more than I did. That's tough for me to say. Or anyone else. I read her book. It's an eye-opener. You don't even have to know all the ins and outs of the Zahau death to find it an intriguing reveal. And the irony running through all of this is here we have a famous true crime author exploring whether or not there was a crime. Caitlin is going to peel back for you the story behind her book, Death on Ocean Boulevard. But first, Caitlin, what's the reaction been? I've seen you on TV and the newspaper. What's going on with this book?
Well, you know, I actually have been scheduling appearances for quite some time, and I just wanted to pace myself and make sure I could do all of it. So it may look like it's all happening all at once this weekend, but it's because I pre-recorded interviews. But I have just been absolutely thrilled with the reaction. I mean, I feel so excited because everybody seems so excited about this book. It's almost like it's my first book again, and this is number 14 for me. But if you remember, my very first book was the Caitlin Rother case, and I had a similar reaction to that book when it first came out, and I was very lucky to have a first book that did so well. But I'm hoping that this one will do even better. But it's been a while since I've had a local case, and something so compelling. So a lot of people are anticipating this book, and now they got it today, and they're all emailing me and posting pictures, and it's been awesome.
Great, glad to hear it. And I know you worked hard on this one for a long time. Let me ask you the first question. You put yourself in this book. You are part of this long-running plot, long-running drama. Why'd you take this approach? How did it help you tell this story?
Well, when I first heard about this case, just like everybody else in San Diego, you know, we all thought, wow, that's a bizarre, suspicious death. That sounds like a murder. Who would do that to themselves, especially a woman? Hanging herself naked, bound and gagged in public like that. And so, you know, but for me, I have a personal interest, not just because I write true crime books, but because my late husband died by suicide and he hung himself. So, I mean, I immediately was drawn to this case and was haunted by this case, but you know, it was just really just so unusual. That's the biggest thing. But over time, you know, it became more and more of a personal thing for me and an obsession for me. And it's partly because of what happened to my husband. It's also partly because this case is just such a compelling case.
You know, I've read most of your books, and I noticed that, like in Lost Girls, John Gardner, Kidnap Murders, your style is developing true crime stories following a narrative nonfiction format. What's the process in doing a book like this? How does that work?
Okay, so narrative nonfiction is what I write, where basically it reads like a novel, but everything in it is true. I don't make anything up. I don't create anything. I don't embellish anything. I don't exaggerate anything. I don't assume anything. I mostly interpret or analyze. I present information, but I have to really be authoritative. I have to really know the subject. I have to do, you know, in the newspaper or even on TV, you know, they interview people, they have one source one-on-one. I have to interview a lot of people or have a lot of different sources, and then I have to weave them all together so that I have an authoritative voice, a narrative voice that that I know what I'm talking about. And that doesn't mean I know the truth or that somebody that I'm presenting in a scene is necessarily telling the truth. It doesn't mean that everything in my book is the absolute truth. It just means that I have to think they're credible enough to put in, or I want to show the reader what they're really like for them to decide for themselves if the person is telling the truth or not. And I put in lots of context around it. But it's scenes. It's basically characters talking to each other's and scenes, just like a novel.
And it builds.
And it has to have a story arc. So the thing about this book is, honestly, I rewrote the last few chapters toward the end and rewrote them. And like the last chapter, I don't know how many times I rewrote the last chapter because there kept being new developments in this case. In fact, even now, there's still new developments in this case and the book is published, but I can't call it back and go, hey, I need a new last chapter. So.
Well, and speaking of all the work you did to run down the elements, you when chasing this story, you went where other writers and journalists like myself have not gone in pursuing the truth. I know for a fact that the sheriff's investigative file is like, can you see that? About that big. There's a lot of stuff to it. There's a massive amount of information in this case. And you've collected a lot of information over what, 9 years that you've been working on this thing? 9 years.
Yep.
And before you wrote it. Tell me about this process. This is, for me as an investigative producer, the most interesting part to me. How did you dig this stuff out? Where did you go? What did you do?
Well, when the case first hit the news, like I said, I was intrigued. I wanted the autopsy reports, okay? And I wanted to go to the news conference at the sheriff's department. So I asked to go and I was told I couldn't go. So right away, I wasn't even treated like regular media gets to go. I used to be able to go to these things. I went to the sheriff's department news conference for the John Gardner case, even though I don't have a press pass. That's their rule now, to keep out bloggers that aren't real journalists. I don't even know what that rule means, frankly, because they know who I am. I've written these very in-depth books, but for some reason, they just didn't want me there. And that made me immediately suspicious. My hinky meter went off, as I like to call it. And people say, what is that? I go, well, it sort of sounds like a squeaky door. It goes, that's your hinky meter. But anyway, I couldn't get in. So, in early days, I had sources bring me stuff or send me stuff if I asked them. They shared with me, and I started collecting. But if you remember, the sheriff's department said it was a suicide. So there were no suspects. There was one person of interest, and that was Adam Shacknai, who they ruled out, by the sounds of the interviews that I got to read from the sheriff's file. They were leaning towards the suicide findings in the very first week. So anyway, it's hard to write a book when there's no arrest, there's no suspect, and then they say it's not even a crime. So here I am, and I'm going to speak at, public appearances around the county like I normally do. And people are like, oh, are you going to write about the Coronado Mansion murder? And I say, well, the sheriff's department say it's not a murder, so I can't really write about it because it's not a crime. So I had to wait for the case to get into the courts. And then, then the research opens up. I sat through every day of the trial. And then after that, I did even more research, and I'll get more into that as we get into your other questions.
The trial. What trial?
The civil trial of Adam Shacknai that the Zahaus filed against, well, initially they filed against Dina Shacknai, Dina's sister, Nina Romano, and Adam Shacknai. But over time, Keith Greer, the Zahaus attorneys, announced that he was dismissing and releasing the two women from the case, which just left Adam.
And you covered all the trials, you watched everything on. Where else were you snooping around, looking?
So and early on, I had some sources bring me information, including the sheriff's file. So, and I managed to get that from more than one source. So that was nice too. So I have good sources, and they're not all in San Diego, just in case anybody wants to try to be a detective and try to figure out who my sources are. then I got a lot of conspiracy theories. People were giving me this theory and that theory and this theory and that theory. They were showing me pictures. They were telling me this. They were like, pss, 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 and I'm like, okay. So I went down a lot of rabbit holes, and a lot of them just didn't pan out. There just wasn't anything to them. The people who were passing these theories on to somebody else who passed them on to me turned out not to be credible, but it took a long time. I had to do a lot of turning over a lot of rocks. I did a lot of research through court records. And then, I had all the interviews that the detectives did. So not only do I have my own interviews that I did, but I got to read the detectives' interviews. So there were a couple with Jonah Shacknai. There were some with, Adam Shacknai. There were Rebecca's sisters. There was Rebecca's ex-husband, who I was really curious to hear his story, where he was at the time, and did he abuse Rebecca or did he not abuse Rebecca? And then I went from things that I picked up in the trial, and then I pursued those leads, and I interviewed, an old boyfriend of Rebecca's who was very eye-opening and helpful, Michael Berger. I don't want to keep talking. I'll let you ask me some other follow-up questions, so I'm just not blah, blah, blah.
Well, that's no problem. I'm hearing all the stuff you're into.
Okay.
It lasted 9 years, the chase. Because you had so much material. Were you ever frightened because you're dealing with, it could be a possible murderer out there and you're asking questions? I mean, what was going through your head when you're doing this? 9 years is a long run.
I'm drinking some ginger lemon because I want to make sure I can keep my voice, and then I choke myself. Yeah, initially, before it got into the lawsuit arena in court, when everybody was saying the Coronado Mansion murder, and I was hearing all these conspiracy theories, they were that she was murdered, and it was so-and-so did it, or so-and-so, we don't know who it was a hitman, and this person has these ties to this bad thing. And, I had to just follow all those tentacles. And like I said, I just wasn't finding anything to those things. So, I start out with some questions. That's another thing that I do as part of the process. What do I really want to know? Because I know that what I want to know is going to interest everybody else, because they're going to have similar questions. So, characters. A book like this has to have characters, just like a novel does. Narrative nonfiction, you have to have characters. So the main characters to me that I really wanted to know about were the people who were mentioned the most in all of these theories. And even though they weren't official suspects, they sure were talked a lot about online, on web sleuths, on other forums where there was a lot of discussion. People were posting court filings. People were posting clearly inside information. It was obvious that there were people from inside different parts of the case, different parties in the case, who were either having other people post for them or they were posing as somebody else. And it was clear that there was a lot going on, even online, a lot of discussions. So, I wanted to find out who Rebecca was. I wanted to find out who Jonah Shacknai was. I wanted to find out who Adam Shacknai was. I wanted to find out, who Dina Shacknai was. And obviously her sister too, but, she wasn't as central a character, but she did go to the house that night and she admitted to police that she did. I also wanted to find out about Max Shacknai because, I want to make it really clear that, this is not a parlor game. A lot of people are about, what happened to Rebecca Shacknai? It's the mysterious death, and it's a book and it's dramatic, but 2 people are dead, and that is a tragedy, no matter how you look at it. And I wanted to find out what happened to Max too. And then every book that I write, I always want to do a very deep biographical tribute to victims, whether they're, suicide or murder. I still wanted to know who they were because these 2 deaths are intricately linked in this case as well.
And were you ever jittery about any of this?
Yeah, so of course, I mean, I was worried that there might be a murder on the loose. And initially I tried to stay away from this case, honestly, but there were some people who were very insistent and they really wanted me to look into this. I mean, they're like, you're the one who's going to be able to do this. You're the one who's going to find the justice. I'm like, wow, that's a lot of pressure. But, I just kept having these conversations and that went on for years. And the other issue is because it was still, not even at trial yet until 2018. I mean, I could have been sued. You can't just go around and accuse people of murder. we have laws, we have defamation and libel, and I wouldn't want to do that. And the sheriffs were saying there was no crime. So that's a tricky balance for somebody who's self-employed like me to try to keep working in this town. And you can't go around accusing people of crimes. So.
Plus, you didn't know what was, the whole truth.
And I had no basis to accuse anybody of a crime either. So.
And, I noticed in the book, you didn't take a position on what happened at the mansion, suicide or murder. It's a question everyone's been wanting a definitive answer to. Why did you not reach a firm conclusion?
I'm a trained journalist, and we are trained not to take a position. We are trained not to have opinions. I mean, I had to train myself essentially over, I was a reporter for 19, 20 years, daily journalist. And, there are some authors in true crime who do take positions and do express their opinions. And, my agent actually kind of early on was trying to get me to take one. And I just said, I'm just not comfortable. I don't really know what happened. And I'm glad I didn't do that because frankly, it was like a tennis match half the time. I was going back and forth, murder, suicide. I'd come across an interview or I'd find some information. I'd be like, oh, I think I figured this out. And then it would be like the next thing, it would take me the total opposite direction. And I still feel like that today. Honestly, I don't think that either suicide or murder holds up completely. There are big holes in both theories. And the reason that it hasn't gone to criminal court is because they have not met a criminal threshold. There is not the forensic evidence that ties Adam Shacknight to the scene more than, an interpretation of the evidence. There's nothing concrete. The Zahaus have a theory about, that they presented in court, and it's in the book, but that has some holes in it too. So, and there's some maybes and there's some questions, and I think there's just too many unanswered questions at this point to try to have a resolution either way. And so I just think, I have some feelings, some leanings, but I have them in both directions. So.
I appreciate your integrity on that. I mean, that was one reason I gave it up, because I actually went out, I got to find out who did it, how they did it, and I realized, I wish I'd thought of what you did. Just lay it all out there. Let the information speak. That's what a journalist does. And you've done a terrific job in this book with that.
Thank you.
You talked about Rebecca as one of the victims here, or a victim of this. And you turned up, there was a lot of information about Rebecca in the book. How did you do that? How did you develop that? Can you give us some little pieces of information about what you found?
Well, okay. So in the trial, one of the things that bothered me, and I'm sure bothered the Zahau family, is that Adam Shacknight's defense team painted her as this, reckless, impulsive woman who slept around and shoplifted and faked her own kidnapping. And I just thought, wow, okay. They showed snippets of depositions by her ex-husband and her former boyfriend, but they were such tiny little short snippets that I just went, what? So I just really wanted to talk to Michael Berger, which is the former boyfriend who she lived with briefly while she was still married. He thought that she was going through a divorce because that's what she told him. And it turned out that she was still married. In fact, had never filed a single paper. And in fact, neither had her husband. So they were still married. They weren't getting along, but they were still even living in the same house together. So she's telling Michael Berger that, she's going through a divorce. She's just waiting for the paperwork to come through. And so, as I'm going through this, I've read the Neil Nalepa detective interviews by the detectives. I've read Jonah Shacknight's 2 interviews with the detectives. And I'm reading Snoam, who is Rebecca's sister who lives in Germany, and Mary, who lives in Missouri. Her 2 sisters were also interviewed by the detective. So I had access to all those interviews. And I started seeing some disparities. So she's telling different people different things. And then I went to the records and I, looked up Rebecca's shoplifting incident and looked at the police report. And I called up Michael Berger and I started asking him about this kidnapping thing that he mentioned at trial. So it took us, a number of interviews. He was very genuine, very sweet man, very gentle. He still loves her to this day. And he still thinks that she did not commit suicide too, by the way. And he called up the sheriff's department. He told them, I have tapes of him calling too, because that was in the information that I got early on. I actually have the audio as well as the transcripts of these interviews. So I could hear their tone of voice. So I just started seeing a picture of Rebecca that I was seeing things that I didn't know about before. Her family said she was so religious. She was so modest. She never would have done this. And early on, even Jonah Shacknai said he didn't think she committed suicide either. He was convinced that she never would have done that to him because it would have drawn so much attention to him and his business, which it did. And it did hurt his business. And he told the sheriff that and said, can't you, say something that I'm not, a suspect, or can you say something? And that's part of the controversy of this case, as that conversation that he had with detectives. So anyway, I'm absorbing all this and I'm getting this picture of Rebecca that maybe isn't what the family said. And I'm thinking, well, okay, so she told different things to different people. And so I wanted to really get into that. So she would be a three-dimensional person to the best of my ability, not just, what they painted her as in court or just what the family wanted to say. She was this very narrow, happy, positive, strong person. I think there was much more nuance to Rebecca. She's much more complicated than that. And I think she was also a troubled person based on the notes on her phone that she left, based on, the problems she was having in her relationship with Jonah, and how she really wanted to appear to her family that she was in a serious relationship. And I don't think she's a bad person for telling those different stories, but I just wanted to explore that more and understand why.
Did you ever talk to a psychologist or somebody about the people that act like this? I'm just curious.
Well, that's part of what makes this book personal. So as I'm interviewing Michael Berger and I'm reading these interviews, I'm also trying to get in contact with other people, including Jonah Shacknai, Dina Shacknai, Nina Romano, Adam Shacknai. I wanted to interview everybody, but I, took it piece by piece. And I just kept hearing from everybody that Jonah Shacknai is just not talking to anyone. So I didn't try to reach him right away. I did ultimately talk to him quite a bit, and I know we're going to talk about that in a minute, but tell me your question again. I've lost track now.
Well, I'm just wondering, you kind of in your mind, I'm sure you've dealt with people that have all types of psychological.
Oh, that's right. Yes, thank you. So part of what I brought to this story is my own personal experience in writing about suicide. The story that I was nominated for a Pulitzer for with the Union Tribune was about a suicide, actually, that happened in Santee. It was a 19-year-old male, and he lit himself out on fire outside of the Walmart, and his family had no idea that he was going to do that or that he was feeling depressed. They had no clue. And so what I learned early on, even before my own husband committed suicide, was that families are surprised sometimes when their family member, dies by suicide. They aren't expecting it. Now, I was expecting it because I knew that my husband was sick. He had been diagnosed as depressed. He was a chronic alcoholic. He was in recovery, but, we had a pretty roller coaster marriage. I actually wrote a short memoir about it called Secrets, Lies, and Shoelaces, if anybody wants to read that, because it definitely has a bearing on this case and my perspective on this case and what I brought to this case. But I wasn't surprised. I was actually waiting for the call that he was dead. I knew it in here. Now, clearly the Zahaus didn't feel that way. She'd never told them that she was depressed. She never had been addicted to anything. She didn't do alcohol or drugs. She, they didn't even know that she was sad or depressed, like it showed in those notes on her phone. So I started seeing parallels in some of the behaviors. My husband, which is not like the most fun thing to talk about, but he was arrested for shoplifting while he was in a blackout representing the county of San Diego because he was the chief investment officer for the county pension fund. It was horribly embarrassing for me when I was working at the newspaper, but he went into a blackout and he shoplifted from the gift store. And he ended up going through the very same diversion program that Rebecca did, obviously not at the same time, but I just thought that was a really curious coincidence. And when Rebecca called up Michael Berger, when she said she was kidnapped, she said, they've got me, I've got my eyes covered. He's like, where are you? Where are you? She's like, well, they just let me go to the bathroom. And well, what happened? She goes, I don't know. They took me. And she was crying. And, it just sounded, well, he was describing it to me in great detail. And it sounded a lot like what my husband did to me. He did the exact same thing. He kind of disappeared on me one evening, and I didn't know where he was, and I was waiting dinner on him, and he came home and he was crying and telling me this whole story about how the police had taken him and done some cavity search. And I was just going, oh my God, but he was so believable because he was crying. And so I was just seeing these parallels. And so I'm not going to diagnose Rebecca with anything, but I'm just saying, I think there was more going on with her when I started noticing some of these similar behaviors. And so I'm not saying she committed suicide. I'm not saying they're the same case. There's, there are obviously a lot of very big contrasts too between Rebecca and my husband as well. Yeah, it's a lot. I had a lot going on. And I just wanted to add one more thing, and that is during the trial, that was one of the hardest parts for me in this whole case was sitting in the trial and listening to the psychiatrist who was testifying for the defense about all the risk factors that he saw in Rebecca that would make her have committed suicide that he saw. So there was molestation by her and her, of her and her sisters. There was growing up really poor as a political refugee and not having enough to eat and being, having that kind of insecurity. And then a low self-esteem, he said. He just went through this whole list. And I was sitting there reliving everything that happened to me and my husband in the last days and going click, check. That was very difficult for me to sit in that courtroom, but it helped me understand Rebecca and what happened. So if that's what happened.
Thanks. Yeah. Listen, Rebecca's boyfriend, Jonai Shakdai, he owned the mansion, Spreckles. What information did he provide you that added to the story, and why was it important? And how did you able to connect to him? And tell us the story behind. You were in the publisher's hands, and suddenly this guy comes into the picture, and not only is he going to talk, but you end up talking to him 8 times. Right. How did it all come down?
Okay, so first of all, it wasn't quite in the publisher's hands yet, but it was very close. So I was basically done writing the book, so I thought. And I always write long. And so I was at this point where I was going to have to start trimming. And this is my process. I always write long, and then I got to squish. I got to pull words out, and then I kind of shrink it down. And that's why I get so many details into the book. But I had reached out to his former PR firm trying to reach him and saying, I want to interview him, but he didn't get the message for quite a while because that was no longer his PR firm. The person who I had the business card for was out on medical leave or something. Anyway, it just took a long time to reach him. And so he emailed me and he said, I want to have a conversation to see if, I'd feel comfortable doing this interview with you. And I said, okay. So he asked me a bunch of questions because he had heard some things that I had said, I guess probably when I was doing trial commentary for KUSI, that sort of thing. And so I had to basically tell him, no, haven't made up my mind. And, I still have an open mind and I'm being objective. I'm not taking a side, blah, blah, blah. So we started these interviews and I ended up doing 8 interviews. And these were, like 2-hour interviews, and they were all by Skype because he initially wanted to meet face to face, and I didn't want to because we were right at the fear level with COVID, and it was brand new, and I was freaking out. And then finally he agreed. He's like, okay, we'll just do it on Skype. I said, great. So we did it at night too, and it got very difficult for him because I was asking him to relive these scenes, with his son, and with Rebecca that were very difficult for him. And, the thing that I learned about Jonah is, he didn't show the world who I saw during these interviews. I mean, he cried while we were talking. And I said, if you had let somebody see you cry before, they might not have these ideas about you. He goes, well, it's not my job to let people see me cry, and I'm just like, well, I don't mean that. I just mean, you're a hard person to read. And I think it's really good that you're talking to me, because now I can share your perspective and in the context of who you are and your relationship with Rebecca and your side of it, because so far, we hadn't heard his side of it. And I think it made a really, really big difference to me, because that was partly how I was able to see how Rebecca was telling everybody such different stories. If you don't get the people who she's telling the different stories to, you only hear one story, one side of it, you don't get a complex picture of who the person really is. So I was able to do that because I had now Michael Berger, I had Neil Nalepa's interview transcript. I wasn't able to find him. And then I had Jonah, and I had the sisters and their interviews with detectives. And I had everything that everybody said in the public domain on TV a million times and to the press. And I had all that information. I was able to start really seeing a big picture that nobody else really had access to.
But that says something when you can convince this guy. He was a hard get. I mean,
Oh, yeah,
God,
he was a hard get.
He comes to you. And you're saying maybe it was the way you handled your TV gig when you were covering the trial, or you think he trusted you?
No, I'm saying he didn't actually really trust me. That's why he wanted to talk. He wasn't sure he could trust me. He wanted to find out if he could trust me. But you know what I did? I shared a lot of what happened with my husband with him. And I let him, share things. I don't judge when I interview people. I just let them talk. I ask them questions. And I say, here's what so-and-so said. Can you tell me your side? He gave me a lot of information that I was then able to go to other people who wouldn't talk to me before and get them to talk to me because they wanted to respond to what he had said. And that's kind of what happened with Keith Greer. Didn't want to participate in the book. He said he was real happy for me, but he was writing his own book. So he says, I want to tell my story. So you go ahead and do yours and I'll do mine.
Explain who Greer is.
Keith Greer is the Zahau's attorney.
Zahau's attorney.
Yeah.
Right.
He's the one who's still handling their lawsuit that they just filed now about against the sheriff's department, trying to get more records so that they can try to get more evidence so that they can actually bring it up to the criminal threshold by, maybe the sheriffs were holding some things back. That's what they think.
Well, speaking of the department, during this ordeal, they've been under a lot of pressure. I mean, that office was under a lot of pressure in pursuing the case. Some still don't believe the findings, even though the agency eventually opened an investigation, and they did that. Then they did that review after the case. Do you think that they did enough on this case the sheriff's department?
That's a hard question because I still have to work in this town. But as I show in my book, Sheriff Gore did finally sit down with me. He initially didn't want to, and he declined my interview request. I was kept out of 2 news conferences, so I really didn't have a great, view of that. But they did sit down with me. Some detectives from the review team sat down with me after the news conference, and then Sheriff Gore did sit down with me. So, and I did have their entire investigative file. But I wanted to hear, what Sheriff Gore, why did he think it was a suicide? Why were they so set on this suicide thing? And I also, talked to them about the allegations that have been made by the Zahaus about, corruption and some collusion with the Shacknai family. Why were they sharing information with Jonah Shacknai? Jonah says they didn't. But the Zahaus feel that they did. And, so I asked him about all of those allegations. That's all in the book. But there are a number of outside experts who've looked at this case, and including the ones who testified at the trial, who've found holes in the case and have found some things that they think they missed and overlooked. And so, I agree with some of those things for sure. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions. And even as the judge said, the sheriff's investigation leaves as many questions unanswered as it answers. So I would agree with that. And that's why I'm saying I can't say that it was a suicide. because there are still so many, there are things that don't make sense. There are things about the suicide theory that don't make sense. Why wasn't she decapitated when she went over a 9-foot fall? How would she know how much length to make when she cut that rope? How would she even think to tie herself up that way? Why would she tie herself up that way? Why, if she did commit suicide, did she put that message on the door? What does that even mean? And why is it in the third person? And these are questions that they can't answer, you know? And so then why didn't they take Adam's phone? Why did they not even look at Adam's phone just to back up his story about where he said he was? Because, you know, when you make a cell phone call, there's a cell tower nearby, and I've written several books where they've caught killers that way, where they say, "Oh, I wasn't there." They're like, "Oh, so your phone was there and you weren't there," you know. So that's a way of tracking people and proving people's innocence as well. But they didn't do those things. They didn't do. There's another investigator who looked at this case. A couple of them said Adam's polygraph was clearly deceptive. They said that the crime lab didn't use enough swabs to do the DNA testing on the door, for example, and they saturated one swab when they should have maybe used multiple swabs because it's such a big service. Anyway, that's just kind of a quick gunshot approach of all the unanswered questions.
That's just some of them too. I mean, I've got I saw the coroner's report, the coroner pictures, and I had a ton of questions.
But I have one more thing that I want to say. One more thing I want to say, and then is we also live in a time where people are not believing in science. There are a lot of people in this country right now who don't believe that they should trust, science. And that's been a real problem with COVID, with vaccination. And that's how the sheriff's department feels. They say, look, there's nothing tying Adam Shacknai to the scene. His DNA and fingerprints simply were not found there. And they can't prove that he was there. They can't build a case that he was a killer if they don't have the evidence. And so, and now this is a funny thing that you can see either way. The sheriff said, why would she, if she's going to kill herself, why didn't she, if someone, I can't even remember, I'm going to twist it, I'm going to get it wrong, but it goes both ways. Why would she kill herself that way? Why would a killer, this was what he said, why would a killer kill her that way when it would draw so much attention? Why wouldn't they just, put a gun in her hand and make it look like she shot herself? Why do that crazy, naked, bound and gagged thing? So anyway, there's two sides to all of that.
That's what everybody feels when they read this book. They're going to be kicking that back and forth in their heads. There's still a lot of unanswered, well, I think still some unanswered questions. Do you think Greer is going to get anything? Is there more stuff to get? Just curious on his lawsuit.
I was just saying to someone else that, I've done a number of public records requests in my day, and they simply, I've asked for things. And investigative materials like they're asking for are protected. They've always been protected. So, and it's very frustrating for me when I ask for something. So I think a judge, by saying the sheriff would have to release some of the things they're asking for, would be setting a pretty new legal precedent. So.
But they can't claim it's an investigation because they've closed the case. Isn't that the argument you can make? Hey, why do you have to hold anything? The case is closed.
Yes, you could make that argument. I agree with that. But the Manson case, guess what? They're still using that argument on the Manson case. Manson is dead. The family has been in prison for 50 years. They're still turning down requests including from me on my book that I wrote about that, co-wrote about that. Sorry?
And a good book.
Thank you.
I know you're, hey, quick question. I know we talked about this briefly before, but why did the sheriff's department kind of keep you away from it? They keep you out of those press conferences?
No, I have no press pass.
Okay, that was the reason.
I think Linda wants to take some questions from the audience. Okay.
Go.
We went over time. Oh my.
Oh, it's right on the mark. I'm trying to save.
Oh, is it? Oh, okay. Good for you. I thought I just saw how late it was. I was like, oh, okay.
I'm a TV guy.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. I'm back. We have a few questions. Can everybody hear me? Can you guys hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. We had a few questions here. I wanted to ask a real question though. What about the rope? I always wondered about, did they look into who bought the rope, or was that a factor at all?
Well, okay,
No.
so according to, how do I know this? I don't know exactly how I know this, but supposedly there was this red rope that it went to some kind of, I don't know if it's like a raft or some kind of boating thing for the kids. And so it was like a ski rope.
Oh,
And I think it was about 5 years old. And I think that when that they went into the garage, you could see a space on a shelf where it had been.
huh.
And so basically the sheriff's department and Jonah and Adam all said, well, how would Adam know that the rope was right there in the garage? And how would he know where to find it? Rebecca lived there. Rebecca knew where the rope was.
Okay, so Faith Hoiberg wanted to know, is there still question about the child's death not being an accident, sadly?
Well, I go into all of that in the book because I wanted to know that too. And I always wondered, that nobody saw what happened to Max. Rebecca said she was in the downstairs bathroom and she heard a crash and the dog barking. And she said she came out and she saw Max lying on the floor with a broken chandelier next to him, broken glass all around him. The dog was barking. There was a razor scooter and a soccer ball. So all those variables, almost anything could have happened. So Dina Shacknai, she didn't want to cooperate with this book. Unfortunately, I wish she had, because I could have gotten even more information, but I was able to find lots of information that she'd already said on TV, and got the reports from experts that she hired. She was on Dr. Phil, and they presented a whole set of circumstances that they said that they thought that Max was a homicide victim, not necessarily on purpose, but not at his own hands. And she, for quite some time, was accusing Rebecca of that and was very convinced that Rebecca was to blame. And I think she's backed off that by now, but she was pushing that for quite some time because she and Rebecca, had a lot of conflict. Dina did not, she found out about the shoplifting thing and she told Jonah about it. And, this is the person taking care of my child. And, so there was a lot of conflict between them.
So hard. Okay, Denise Moreno wants to know, who did you spend the most time researching?
Oh, I didn't play favorites. I just spent as much time as I could on everybody, honestly. The main people, though, honestly, are Adam and Jonah and Rebecca, because, Adam's the one who's the accused, the defendant in this case, and Jonah was her boyfriend. It was his house. And, there was a theory, and he even brought this to the detective's attention. He said, do I need to get extra security? I mean, he basically thought maybe he had been the real target, because why would two people so close to him be so severely harmed, within 2 days of each other in the same house?
Right. Okay, you touched on this a little bit, but Michael Welch wanted to know, what do you think is the meaning of the saying left at the scene? She saved him, can you save her?
My mouth is a little dry for a second. Oh. This is so I don't lose my voice. I have to do all these little things. So, I don't really know. Nobody really knows, but there are a lot of theories. There's a lot of possibilities. So we can talk about some of those. There's a theory that if Rebecca committed suicide, why would she write that note? And what would she have meant? Well, okay, she would have been her. And then you, who was you? Was that God? Or was that Jonah? Or was that just a message that was just kind of a strange message to create chaos and confusion? I mean, nobody really knows, but there is a theory that she could have been angry with Jonah because Jonah Jonah says he didn't blame her. He didn't feel angry at her, but he's the one who left her the last voicemail message, and we've never been able to hear the message. And so we have his word of what he said, and what he told me was that, and what he's told the sheriff's department is that he basically called her. It's a 62-second voicemail. And he told me, he didn't tell the sheriffs this because it was the first time it came out, I guess, that he was crying on the phone and he was really upset. He wasn't angry at her or blaming her. He was just really sad because he had heard from the doctor that the best case scenario was that Max would not walk or talk again. So the Zahaus don't necessarily believe that. And they say, well, we've never heard this message. The sheriffs weren't able to get it. All we have is his word. We know it happened though, because it's in the phone records, but why was it deleted? They say, well, why would she delete the message? How do we know she's the one who deleted the message? So there's still all this mystery around who wrote the note. Why was it written? There are other people who think, okay, she was murdered. The killer was angry because it looks, it's the way it's written is pretty aggressive, and she was a painter, but nobody had ever seen anything. She painted birds and flowers and Max playing soccer and animals. And so.
Okay. Anybody else have some questions? We still have, here we go, from Susan, or let me get in the right order here. How about from Hillary Kristen? How much weight do you put into the girl factor, being that Rebecca's hair was under the scarf? Most women would instinctively pull their hair out from under the scarf.
I hear that on every single interview I do with women. They all say that, and I agree. That's a weird thing. The first thing, if you put on anything, it feels weird. You want to pull your hair out. So why would she have the rope there on top of her hair, and then the gag around her mouth, which was a t-shirt, was on top of the rope? So she had two things on top of her hair. So yes, I agree. That's one of those weird things that makes it seem hard to believe that she would do that to herself. But I also want to say that, and I learned this from my own husband's death and from writing about suicide for the newspaper, that, and Jonah Sheck and I said the same thing to me. We discussed this. A person who commits suicide is not in a rational state of mind, and suicide is an irrational act. The person is maybe having a psychotic break. They're not thinking clearly. They're not thinking rationally. So when you try to bring, reason to why did this happen and why did this happen? I mean, this isn't something I like to talk about, but my husband planned his suicide and he had been talking about it. I was his third wife. I ended up talking to his first wife and found out that he had even threatened when he was with her. And when he was found, he had broken glass, like light bulbs, in his stomach. So, I mean, he literally had planned this, that if it didn't work to hang himself, he was going to die somehow by eating this broken glass. There's no evidence on Rebecca's laptop or anything else that she had even looked up suicide, looked up self-tying, anything like that. So that's one of those mysteries about this. It doesn't make sense. Why would she do this if you don't see any signs? She didn't talk about it. She didn't tell anyone about it. And it doesn't seem like she planned it or researched it. So that's another one of those, who knows?
We have some more questions. Are you okay still? How's the voice doing?
Let's see. Well, I can take a few more.
A couple more? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. What similar traits does a true crime case that grabs your interest enough to write a book? So what are the traits that grab your interest to write the book?
Okay. Well, there has to be, this is a practical thing. I can't get a book deal unless there's a court ruling. Let's just start with that, okay? So there are people who email me or call me, ask me to call me right away. I'm like, no. I get these emails all the time. I have a case for you. I'm like, okay. So I have to, number one, have hopefully a criminal conviction of somebody, because otherwise publishers don't want to touch it. It was difficult actually to get a deal on this for a while. We had to kind of talk some publishers through it. there were big publishers who were really interested in this, but a couple of them were like, well, it's not really resolved. So my publisher, who this is my 7th book with them, they liked my approach of, putting myself into it and using my perspective as a lens to look at this case. And so that worked. But, I tend to have themes that draw me to certain cases, mental illness, suicide, addiction. And this case was just such a mystery. It was just so bizarre. I also picked just bizarre cases, bizarre deaths. I want to find out what really happened. And this was definitely fell into that category. And, it has to be something that people are interested in, people that I think, they're going to want to read this book.
Great. Okay, just a couple more here. Let's see. Somebody mentioned, we understand there were Coronado neighbors who reported to the Coronado police, but were never contacted by the sheriff. Did you talk to any of them?
I'm not aware that happened.
Okay.
I'm not sure who they're referring to.
Okay.
Could anybody be more specific if they want to ask that question? Because they did talk to neighbors. They canvassed the whole neighborhood. They interviewed the woman who said she heard a woman yelling, help, help, help me. They interviewed her several times and then just discarded what she had to say. So
yeah, I saw that. Okay, here's another one. Did anybody propose the theory that the murder was done by a hired killer?
Yes.
Perhaps at the ex-wife's behest?
Oh, at the ex-wife's behest. There's all kinds of theories of who wanted to hire the hitman. In fact, Jonah Shacknai, in one of his early interviews with the detectives, he even brought that up as a possibility. He said, I wouldn't like to think that. And but there were people who were thinking that, yes. But there were also other people who thought other people would have hired a hitman. I don't want to list all the people who would have hired the hitman, but, everybody was wondering.
I think everybody has to wonder, how could she have tied herself up and thrown herself over the railing?
Well, I can't answer that, but yes, everyone is wondering that.
Yeah.
The sheriff's department say, they did a video to show how they think it could have happened, but the Zahau's expert in knot tying said that those knots that they used were not the knots that he saw on Rebecca's wrist, so they were too simple. And that when he did a demonstration in the courtroom, they looked highly elaborate and complicated. And even Adam said they looked more complicated than his legal team wanted to make it seem, that he wouldn't have even know how to tie those knots.
Was there any support from Jonah to find the killer of Rebecca?
He thinks she committed suicide.
Okay.
So he did offer at the initial interviews, when he thought that she didn't commit suicide, he did run through some people that might have been possibilities of people who might want to hurt Rebecca or hurt him, but hurting Rebecca in order to hurt him. He did mention a few people, but I didn't use their names or try to describe them in the book because I didn't want to, have anybody suing me, and it's privacy and all that.
Okay, don't all murders always have some things that can't be explained? In your opinion, did this have more than usual?
There's a lot of unanswered questions in this case, and yes,
sounds like it.
Probably more than usual, but yeah, I mean, that's kind of a hard question to quantify. Yep. Yeah.
Were the jurors interviewed after the civil verdict, and was it unanimous?
The civil jurors didn't want to talk to the media. They went out some back door. I know that Adam's defense team did ultimately interview at least one, because I got a transcript of the high points of it, which I put in the book. But nobody would sign an affidavit. So whatever they told investigators, they didn't want to stand behind. So their jury verdict was it. I think that was another 6 questions.
Yeah. So. Well, here's the final one. Okay, like the first one is going to come from me. I want to know, as this all plays out with the new trial and stuff, do you suspect you'll be having a new edition of your book coming out? Do you still feel like you want to see some kind of resolution, if there ever is any?
I don't know that there's going to be another trial. I
No.
think what's happening right now is that there's a lawsuit to try to get some records.
Okay.
That's where we are.
Okay.
My understanding is that's where we are. And then there's another hearing in October where
Okay.
we'll hear, I guess, from the sheriff's department on why they don't want to do that or don't think they should have to do that. That's my understanding. I don't think anybody has said we're going to take this lawsuit to trial. Unless I'm wrong, but I haven't heard that or read that anywhere.
Stop spreading rumors. Well, I just want to thank you so much. And for coming tonight, we had made a certificate for you, and I will go ahead and mail this out to you.
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah, we're really thrilled that you came to us. And it's fascinating. It just really is fascinating and frustrating. And we appreciate how hard that must have been for you to put this all together.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I have one thing I wanted to mention, and that is, I hope everybody buys the book from the bookshop. But if you guys can't find, a lot of my books are now out of print. So if anybody wants back titles, they can contact me through my website, which is caitlinrother.com, because I do sell my back titles privately. So
Is it too late to
stores anymore?
Is it too late to get signed copies, or?
No, you can get
Okay.
signed copies through your bookshop.
Yeah,
she was signing all morning in the park. I delivered all day. So we're ready to roll, whatever people want.
Okay, good. And I recognize some names of people too. And so I personalized some, even if you didn't ask. I hope that was okay. If you wanted to sell it on eBay, sorry.
I see some of our local authors attended tonight, so that's always interesting to see. And just a reminder to everybody, please keep your eye on the event calendar. We have a lot more things coming up too. And we hope to see you there. And we thank you for your support. And
thanks everybody for
we'll
coming.
call it a
I really
night.
appreciate it.